There's a lot of exaggeration out there, especially being put out by the Israeli regime and its allies about how massive the attack was and how destructive it was. And then there were some in Iran who were saying nothing happened. He was saying that we shouldn't exaggerate and believe the exaggerations, but we shouldn't act as if nothing has happened. This was aggression, and there were four officers who were martyred, and there will be harsh retaliation for that. In general, what I can say is that the attack was a failure. Remember, the Israeli Minister of Defense, or the genocide minister, to be more appropriate, he said that the Iranians it will be massive, and the Iranians will not know what hit them. Right? So we were expecting to be knocked out. Well, when the attack happened, first of all, I didn't wake up by no explosion woke me up. Al Jazeera and RT woke me up, and I found out that there was something going on. Second of all, you've seen footage from Ukraine for 2.5 years now. It's regular news. Of course, in the last few weeks, it hasn't been in the news, but you've seen secondary explosions. So, for example, if an S-300 is struck, you see these huge secondary explosions. There were no secondary explosions anywhere in Iran. And you can't hide it because, for example, Parchin, which is to the east of Tehran, is visible from where we are. And even if it's not directly visible, let's say there's a hill behind whatever struck, the light from the explosion would be visible from many parts of Tehran. And so the fact is that these strikes were not successful. Yes, they hit a number of radar systems, or factories, but Iran doesn't have any strategic factories on the ground. All of its key installations have been gradually removed, put underground for over the last 2 decades. Ever since the United States began to talk about striking Iran, which goes back to the Khatami era, many, many years ago, Iran began to transfer all of its key assets underground. And of course, it began to develop also an anti-aircraft or anti-missile system to defend the country. But anything that is on the ground is not strategic, and also they're spread out. They're not huge factories. They're, small workshops. That's also true for the nuclear program. The Israeli regime can bomb the Iranian nuclear program. The air defenses may bring down a lot of missiles. Some, let's say, may get through. Those that get through may cause damage, but the damage is not damage that would be devastating to the nuclear program because it is extremely well protected, not against Israel, against the United States. The objective was to protect the country against the United States. Israel is nothing. Israel without an air bridge 24 hours a day bringing in weapons from the West would collapse within a week. The only reason why the Israelis can constantly slaughter women and children is because the West gives them the ability to do so. And that's why I don't believe the West is at all sincere about UNRWA, because they are helping with the Holocaust, and they are allowing the northern Gaza to be starved and people to be massacred simultaneously, and they do nothing about it, and the Western media is quiet. They won't, as I said, if they did rolling coverage for a week, it would be over. Northern Gaza would be, if they did rolling coverage over Gaza for a week, I promise you, it would be over. Because the embarrassment in Western capitals would be beyond belief. Not because they're against it. They know exactly what's going on. Western diplomats in Beirut, they know exactly that the Israelis are destroying homes and apartment blocks. They know it. They live there. Western journalists are based there. They know exactly that civilian targets are being killed. But they say Hezbollah strongholds, Hezbollah targets. in order for people to think that these are legitimate targets. But they're wiping out the whole towns and villages and cities, just like the you know the most evil regimes in human history. No difference. But again, as I said, the West will whitewash, Western media, Western journalists will and Western diplomats will whitewash all these crimes until the last Palestinian is killed, and until the last Lebanese child is killed, if they could get away with it, and they can't. But in the broader sense, that the Israeli regime has been shown to be not nearly as powerful as it presents itself to be, and the attacks on Iran are further. Remember, in Gaza, they said we're going to starve the people. They're all Amalek, right? So they're subhuman, basically. That's what they said from the very beginning. Anyone who read the South African complaint to the ICJ would know clearly what I'm talking about. The Israelis spoke of the Palestinians, their leaders spoke about the Palestinians as subhuman, and they were going to starve and kill and massacre everyone. That's anyone who reads the ICJ, it's clear that the intention to carry out a Holocaust was there. But the Israelis failed. And I said many months ago that the Israelis will expand the war in Lebanon. Why did I say that? Because the Israeli regime lost in Gaza. They needed to expand the war elsewhere to shift attention away from Gaza. In Lebanon, they failed. I was in Beirut. Anyone can look up my interviews. When they carried out the assault on Lebanon and killed 500 people on the first day, just slaughtering people across the country, I quickly got a ticket and went to Beirut. I took some aid, but I basically went there to see if I could help with media. And then while I was there, Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah was martyred. And how did they martyr him? This is what the Western media doesn't like to focus on. They massacred a couple of hundred people. They destroyed 6 apartment towers that I'd walked by many times. I lived in southern Beirut for a year when I was on my sabbatical in Beirut. I was working at AUB, the American University of Beirut, and at Conflicts Forum, a think tank there, based there. So ordinary families lived there. It was just a part of the a neighborhood in southern Beirut. They wiped it out. They completely wiped out that neighborhood. But the Western media only focuses on like the martyrdom of Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah. But in any case, they interviewed me and said, I was interviewed multiple times. They're all online. I said, what they said, what will happen to Hezbollah? I said, it'll grow stronger. And time will tell. What happened? Just last night, there were heavy battles on the border between Palestine and Lebanon in the Al-Khiyam area. The Israelis failed. After a month, the Israelis have failed to take southern Lebanon. They were supposed to take a huge chunk of southern Lebanon and occupy it to make it safe for the colonizers in northern Palestine to go back home. They failed. What they did was they destroyed people's homes and towns. They just like what they did in Gaza, intentional destruction of private property, and of course the massacre of ordinary people, which last night in Baalbek they killed between 50 and 100 people. I've tweeted some of the images. Women, children, they don't care. But in any case, they failed there too. So when the failure in Lebanon was evident after the first few days, it was obvious that they were going to escalate to Iran, because now they have to distract attention away from their failure in Lebanon. So they carry out this strike against Iran, and they have to say it was a massive success. But just going back to what the Minister of Genocide in Israel said, the Minister of Holocaust in Israel said, he said the Iranians will not know what hit them. Okay. Everyone woke up. Many people actually didn't know what hit them, because when they got up in the morning, they didn't even know that there was an attack. They went to work and someone said, yes, there were attacks. I said, what? In that sense, they were right. It was so insignificant. Of course, it causes damage. Of course, one of the things about the Iranians is, contrary to what the West says and contrary to what the West is, the Iranians are honest. They announced their marchers immediately. There are two, and then two more who were severely injured passed away, and there was a fifth person who was not a part of the air defense system. So four people were martyred. So obviously damage was done. But again, damage in the sense that you have these huge explosions and huge damage. No, that didn't happen. And as I said, and I've been saying this before the Israeli regime began to even talk seriously about striking Iran, that anything linked to the military or the nuclear program is well protected. And Iran's offensive capabilities, its missile and drone capabilities, are also very well protected. They have cities underground across the country. Remember, these drone cities and missile cities were all created across the country to defend the country against the United States. This puny colony, which is completely dependent on the West to slaughter and kill, is not in a position to seriously hurt Iran. The warheads on the missiles that they fired are much smaller than the warheads that the Iranian missiles use when they strike Israel. And in fact, the best comparison is just to go back to the footage of the Iranian missile strikes and then compare that to the footage of the Israeli missile strikes. Any layman like me would be able to see that there is a big difference between the two. So the Israelis failed in Gaza, they failed in Lebanon, they failed against Iran, and they will continue to fail. But the West will empower them to keep the slaughter going. Because as I said, the West is so utterly evil that it will allow the Israelis to obliterate the Palestinian people, and they will continue to support it if it comes to that. But it won't, because the Israeli regime will fail, and it will be forced to end this war at some point. And when it does, the war will end in failure. And that will be a very important turning point for the demise of the regime. And one point that I think is also important is that the objective now for the Israeli regime is to bring in the United States. They want the United States to enter the war, and which is not impossible. The Americans obviously don't want it, but Netanyahu doesn't care about the United States. He doesn't care about India. He doesn't care about any country, because if the Americans come into the war, then the Iranians will have to destroy all American bases in the Persian Gulf. But far more important than the American bases is that those countries that host those bases, they will cease to exist. They are small, weak, vulnerable regimes that do not have the ability to defend themselves. Their oil and gas installations will be gone. So if the Americans start a war, then it's war, because this will be a fight for our survival. And the Iraqi resistance will wipe out the Americans in Iraq and Syria immediately. Immediately. It will be very swift. And that would lead to a global economic collapse that will impact the world for probably decades. Does Israel care? No. Does Netanyahu care? No. He doesn't care about India. He doesn't care about the United States. He doesn't care about Europe. He doesn't care about anyone. They care about themselves. Iran does not want the war to expand, but Iran will retaliate. Why? Because if Iran doesn't retaliate and create deterrence, the regime will just do it again, because the Americans and the Europeans will enable them to do it. They enable them to carry out a Holocaust. You think they won't allow them to carry out another strike on Iran? Of course they will. The West will give them whatever they need. So Iran has to create deterrence. Iran has to slap down Netanyahu because the West won't yank hard on his leash. And so we are in a dangerous situation, because Iran will have to respond, and Iran will strike hard, very hard. And I think these people should take me seriously, because in the past, when I said Iran will strike, the last time around, they said it won't, but we saw what happened. This time, Iran will hit very hard. And what will the Israeli regime do in response? Who knows? What will happen? I don't know. There are different scenarios. But if the Americans get involved, then everything will change. But the Americans won't win. Everyone will lose.
You made the key argument, in fact, key point, I would say, that the escalation in Lebanon and then eventually to Iran is fundamentally born out of Israel's failure to make Gaza unlivable or ethnically cleanse Gaza out of the Palestinians completely. And there are reports now that says that in the immediate wake of October 1, when the ground incursions had started, some of those protesters were protesting against Netanyahu, not because they oppose colonialism, but primarily because of Netanyahu's failure to bring back the hostages. They were much more sympathetic and supportive of the government, of the Zionist regime, because the war had escalated. And I think it is in this light one must understand the Israeli escalation to Lebanon and eventually to Iran. And I think this ties to your second key point, that this is not Israel itself, but the Israeli-American alliance that is after Iran. And even with the recent on Saturday attack, I mean, one US defense official says that it is almost entirely likely that F-35 stealth fighters were used to initially clear the airspace, creating what they call the air corridor through Syria, because they say that the Americans control the Syrian airspace and Iraqi airspace. So it's almost inconceivable to go into Iran without full support of American military, and eventually using even maybe the heavier F-16 and F-15, also the C-2 refueling aircraft. So can you, this is my last point on this. You make this important point that the Iranian preparation for defense and resistance has been not particularly against Israel, which is one piece of it, but actually against the superpower itself in the wake of the invasion after the 9/11 of Afghanistan, of Iraq, and so on. A lot of people, I think, fails to understand the Iranian strengths because they don't understand the context, or maybe there is a lot of amnesia regarding the full American strategy of invading Iran, which they had to back down. Can you give us a little bit of historical context on that?
A couple of things first. One is that to put it in language that is understandable to the West, before the Israeli attack on Iran, the markets in Iran were down. And anyone can look this up. It's all online. And the Iranian rial depreciated. The stock market was down. The morning after, hours after the so-called attack, that the Iranians would not know what hit it, or what hit them, markets went straight up. And to use Western terminology, the markets, you can't hide many things from the markets. You can, someone can put, I don't know, patriotic music on television and say that we destroyed the enemy and all that, but markets are markets. They're going to look for the facts and to, figure out. The markets saw this as a failure. That's why they went, that's why they went up so much. So to put it in language that is understandable to Western elites and those who are in power, that I think is significant. So it was obvious it was a failure. Second, what I would like to point out is that the F-35 is not a very good plane, and it's first of all, it's not as stealth as they pretend it to be, and second of all, the payload is very small. It was a failed project, and especially since the Israelis have been using F-35s with the support of the Americans. This was a joint American-Israeli operation. The Americans were part of this aggression against Iran, and they will pay up the price. There are many ways to make the Americans pay a price, and they will pay the price. Remember, they are occupying Iraq and Syria, and Iran has many friends in Iraq. as everyone knows. So, and they're not proxies; they're allies. If proxies don't win against a much more powerful foe. A proxy doesn't defeat the Israeli regime, which has, as I said, an air bridge from Europe and the United States. They don't win battles despite the other side having all the weapons and bunker busters that they need. And 40 white European countries and Western countries providing them with all the intelligence. Their embassies are involved. Their NGOs are involved in spying. Many of their reporters are involved in spying. Their drones are flying over the Mediterranean to help with the genocide in Gaza and the genocidal strikes in Lebanon. They're giving them political cover. They give them ammunition, weapons, and of course the Western media tries to whitewash all their crimes. So uh, these are not proxies in Yemen that make the Red Sea unusable for the Israeli regime and its allies. These are not proxies in Gaza, which are standing in defiance well after a year of Holocaust. And these are not proxies in Lebanon, which are humiliating the Israeli regime who was supposed to take southern Lebanon. They said we destroyed the leadership. And now it will be a piece of cake. They've been humiliated. So these are not proxies. But in any case, these allies will be able to punish the Americans as they are punishing the Israeli regime. But I think it's important to note that what the weapons that the Israelis used, now that they've used them, and the planes that they've used, and the operation that they carried out, a lot of information has been gathered as a result. And the Russians and the Chinese will be very happy to learn about what sort of information has been gathered. And so basically what the Israelis have done is that they've created an opportunity for Iran, Russia, and China to better understand U.S. capabilities. So the Israeli regime, by carrying out this operation, have imposed a huge cost for the entire U.S. military. That's a key point.
A very quick,
but,
sorry, go ahead.
Yes, but historically, the United States, after invading Iraq and Afghanistan, they had effectively surrounded Iran. Remember, back then, Russia was a weak country. China was still growing. The U.S. was able to bully these countries into accepting sanctions against Iran at the UN. The Russians and the Chinese would water them down as much as possible, but they were weak.
The heydays of unipolar world.
Yes, exactly. The hyperpower. So the United States was at the height of its power back then. It was a different world from today for your younger viewers. And it was not such a long time ago. I was your age, but it seems like it was 100 years ago. So the United States was immensely powerful. They invaded Iraq, they invaded Afghanistan. They surrounded Iran. They were in the Persian Gulf. These regimes in the Persian Gulf are basically, they'll do what the Americans want them to do. Every single one of them. Maybe like some of them would be a bit different, but not that much. They won't stand up to the United States by any means. So, and one senior American official said, "Real men go to Tehran," meaning that the objective is to take Tehran. So Iran began to prepare itself back then, and the United States didn't invade Iran. They never even bombed Iran. Why? Because even back then, when Iran was much weaker than it is today, because remember, Iran had just ended a war with Saddam Hussein in 1988, a war where the Americans and the Europeans helped impose. They gave Saddam chemical weapons to use against Iranians. The civilized world was giving him all these banned weapons to use against Iranians. I was gassed twice. When they talk about World War II and gas chambers, and then I was gassed by German chemical weapons. For me, people like me and people who survived in Iran, when the West talks about human rights, it's obvious. It's always been obvious that it's all nonsense. It's all show. They're the greatest violators of human rights on this planet. But part of the reason why, and this is something that I missed earlier, I'm sorry for my disorganized discussion. Part of the reason why people believe that the Israelis are strong is because we are Orientalized Orientals. We still believe what the West tells us. And this is something that I've seen in mainstream Indian media, that if the Reuters says it, if AP says it, if CNN says it, if the Washington Post says it, if the Guardian says it, then it must be true. And my experience has been that it's most probably not true. And if it is true, it is twisted. And history has, history, I think, shows it, but people have short memories or they don't go back for accountability. They don't look back. So, okay, so Iran has been defeated here. So we have no more air defenses. We have no more missile capabilities. So during the next exchange, Iran will not strike Israel hard anymore because Iran won't have the ability to fire off that many missiles anymore. But when that happens, no one is going to go back and say, oh, so the Israelis were lying. Western media was lying. This was just propaganda. This was a part of the propaganda campaign. No, they'll go on to the next lie. And they'll believe that, and they will go on. That is because our minds have been colonized for hundreds of years. We've gained independence as countries. India is an independent country. Iran is an independent country. But many of us are intellectually, we are still colonized. So they continue to be an authority. Even when we oppose them, we will believe them or we give them more credit than that which they deserve. But time will tell. And the world is changing much more rapidly than people in the West think. Not just the BRICS summit. There's so many things happening in Ukraine elsewhere that I think it's going to dawn upon people that the West is sort of like the Wizard of Oz. It's not nearly as powerful as it thinks it is. And but I'm fine with the phrase "time will tell."
I liked your phrase Oriental Orientalists. So it's not what Edward Said said, that how the colonialists represented us, but it's also us buying their narrative. So it's perhaps Said did not emphasize as much. But we understand that being from this part of the world.
Yes, or Malcolm X would call it the house Negro and the field Negro. The house Negro being the slave that is more compliant, who has interest in being with the master, and the slave Negro, or the field Negro is the person who's being brutalized the most and who hates the master. So we have or the comprador class. There are many terms for it. That the brown sahib, the person who mimics or tries to imitate. They love to read Western books and Western novels. They prioritize them over local culture, and the different parts. Different people have used different terms to orientalize. Oriental is basically those of us who we are the non-Westerners, but we are Orientalized. We are Orientalists ourselves. We believe their worldview. We try to be like them. We try to be we try to look more civilized to them, but in their eyes. But as I said, the world is changing, and this is not going to continue for much longer, simply because the facts on the ground are 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 going to make the world a very different place in the near future. Things are changing much more rapidly than anyone ever imagined. The perpetual wars, the never-ending wars, the stupidity of liberal capitalism, and but also the war in Ukraine and the genocide in Gaza. The West in Gaza has exposed itself as being inhumane and barbaric. And the West is now being increasingly, they're a police state. Young people in Australia, young people in Canada and elsewhere, they're intimidated. Shop owner, anyone who wants to protest against Israel is intimidated. They feel threatened that they'll lose their jobs, that they'll get into trouble. So it, it's evident, it's clear that the world is changing, and it's clear to people across the world what the West really is all about. The genocide is not something that will go away. It will be a very dark stain on the West for many decades to come, because this is the first genocide that has been carried out live in front of a global audience. And they will not stop it, despite the fact that we see it when we get up in the morning and when we see it again when we want to go to bed at night. And it irritates us, even though big tech censors, it uses its algorithms downplay what goes on, even though many are banned. But still, people, it's so horrible and horrific and overwhelming that people still see it. And I think this has dealt a devastating blow on. So the Western economy has gone downhill. The Western military has gone downhill. Their military in Ukraine has failed. All their capabilities have failed to deter the Russians. In Gaza, the same is true, but more importantly, and in Lebanon, their military has failed, and in Iran. But more importantly, the image of the Israeli regime and the collective West that stands behind the Holocaust has been totally demolished, and that, I think, has all of these have quickened the pace of the demise of the Western Empire.
Hi, my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have two requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.